World War II is seen as a morally justifiable conflict. If you look at the Holocaust and the liberation of Jews from the Holocaust, there can be no argument that it was the right thing to do. If you look at the war crimes committed collectively by the Japanese, there's no argument that it was the right thing to do. Now, the Cold War, on the other hand, the world quickly becomes a field of gray. And we have to kind of ask ourselves, you know, in a post-World War II world where conflicts generally became asymmetrical, can advanced squad leader actually represent these conflicts and do it in an accurate way, and more importantly, maybe do it in a way that's fun? And so the first thing we need to look at when it comes to this advanced squad leader comp is the rules. Before we take a look at the actual rules that were given for helicopters in the Dien Phu comp game, we need to take a step back and we need to look at what helicopters actually did in regards to the history of the actual battle. Once we have a better understanding of that, we can then kind of move forward and look at helicopter rules and how they should play within the game itself.
From Hell in a Small Place by Bernard Fall, Thursday, March 18th, 1954. Two helicopters from the 1st Light Helicopter Evacuation Company suffered a similar fate. The first landed directly near the main hospital and was able to embark one wounded man. Another helicopter attempted landing at the CP of Mobile Group 9, where Lieutenant Goucher had been killed 5 days earlier, but both had been waved off before it could land. Martin Windrow, best known for his Men at Arms series, which helps a lot of war gamers get their paintings accurately, has actually written a book about Dien Bien Phu, published around 2004. In The Last Valley, he describes a photo of French paratroopers in helicopters, writing that, early evening, 20th November, pairs of the 6th BPC load their wounded onto one of the two helicopters from Mong Sai that flew in the radios for the Air Force ground control team. The helicopter's range was limited to them running a shuttle service for casualties to Mong Sai, where they were triaged. Serious cases were then flown out by Dakotas to Hanoi.
So we've looked at the role of helicopters within the history of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and it seems that all the authors kind of similarly conclude that what did helicopters do? They evacuated the wounded and they evacuated the dead, and they might have dropped off some minor amount of supplies. So their contribution to the overall battle, the win-loss of it, is inconsequential. So you have to wonder, you know, is it really even necessary to put helicopters in the game with all the rules? And absolutely it is not. They weren't used for troop transport, they weren't used for reconnaissance, they weren't used in combat operations to like move a squad 2 miles up or 2 miles down. So frankly, I would just go ahead and scrap them when they do a further release of this game and get rid of the helicopters completely. I understand that Critical Hit does have some other comps that include helicopters, such as the Algerian War and the Vietnam War, and this might be seen as the starter, but that's just too far from accuracy to actually justify, you know, learning all those rules for a battle, you know, that clearly had no real role for helicopters.
What we're looking at here are the rule sets for the Viet Minh Army, what would later become the North Vietnamese Army. Something that's very, very, very odd is that the North Vietnamese Army may not form multi-location fire groups. In addition to that, they're generally treated as Russians, except for within this very small section, they G1424, G163, they're treated like Japanese. This can be extremely problematic for a new starter because now you need to pull out your Code of Bushido or the new Rising Sun and try to remember, you know, subsets of rules within a general rule set for one nationality. And I find that to be extremely problematic.
This is not the first time that I've bought the Dien Bien Phu comp and that I've owned it. In the 2004 release within the rules, Ray Tapio actually wrote that not allowing multiple fire factor groups for the Viet Minh is going to be his most controversial rule. The game has been in production now then for over 10 years. So one has to wonder, why would you even leave a rule in if it's going to be controversial? Why are you going to leave a rule in that's going to make people not enjoy the product? It just seems perfectly logical to me. So if you take that and even sidestep, like, why would I leave a rule in that makes gameplay so untraditional and thus, unenjoyable to a lot of more experienced or inexperienced players? We need to take a look at the actual history of the Viet Minh Army and some of the operations and what they were doing well before the siege of Dien Bien Phu to find that they were perfectly capable of great tactical analysis, of great intelligence, and of great military maneuvering. And when we look at that, it just further confirms that we do not, need to have that rule for them.
In 1950, the French High Command ordered the evacuation of Cao Bang. The main reason being is now that China was communist and part of the Soviet sphere, the Viet Minh were able to get assistance directly from China and training, and the fort just became too difficult to hold. During this time, as they withdrew from Cao Bang, the French ran into ambush after ambush after ambush. These were well-laid ambushes with machine guns, mortar, radio communication. Very dangerous. While it was happening, a relief force from That Key was sent up to meet on RC4 in hopes to relieve the troops moving to their location. And once again, another large ambush happened. And why am I pointing out this particular battle? Well, it's showing one major French defeat that almost caused them to lose the whole war. After they lost RC4, they considered evacuating Hanoi completely. And now we're going to look at some primary sources that kind of go into the great tactical efficiency of the Viet Minh during the Battle of Cao Bang and kind of just further, cement why we should allow the Vietnamese to have multiple fire groups for the Dien Bien Phu comp. 3 trucks exploded, blocking the road. From the head of the pass, the escort half-tracks forced their way back, firing until they too were hit and set on fire, their crews killed. The infantry pickets on the hilltops were pinned down by the weight of the fire. Those on the road itself wiped out. Along the road, hundreds of Viet Minh surged up from the bush in the eastern ravine and began to massacre and loot soldier and civilians alike. A Marine spotter plane radioed Don Key that the center of the convoy was being destroyed and the road was cut in force near both ends. The next day, hacking their way through the flanking brush, infantry reoccupied the route hilltop by hilltop. At midday, they reached the first of 52 burnt-out vehicles. They had found just 4 wounded men alive among a mile and a half of blackened metal and shriveled corpses.
How do you do an accurate map of a battle that's now over 50 years old? It'd be problematic at best to really get it accurate, especially considering the fact that during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French intelligence and commanding officer General de Castries constantly had to get updates from Hanoi with new information in regards to trench lines, fortifications, and where things actually were. It was always very difficult, and it also made their artillery problematic on the French side. That being said, this Advanced Squad Leader comp has absolutely one of the best maps of Dien Bien Phu that I've ever seen, and it's really where the game shines. So let's take a look at that next.
What we're looking at here is my main reference map for the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It is actually a combination of 2 different maps made by Martin Woodrow for his book The Last Valley, and what I consider the most accurate map of Dien Bien Phu that I've ever seen. Now let's take a second and let's zoom in here, and we're actually going to go down and we're going to look at where the scenario takes place at. Here we have the actual headquarters and things like that. But this is Champs-Élysées. This is Elian Fort. This is Baldy and Phony Mountain, where the Viet Minh lobbed artillery and their troops would rush forward from. And sometimes the French would get out of Champs-Élysées and attack both Baldy and Phony Mountain. And sometimes they wouldn't get that far and they would just have to constantly reclaim the territory that the Viet Minh would take. This area became vital during the battle, and when it fell, pretty much the garrison fell. So if we're looking at this historically accurate map, let's pull back and look at what we get, from critical hit. There's Phony Mountain. There's Old Baldy. Although you have to kind of consider the patties within the scenario rules. They're not automatically put on the map. But there's Champs-Élysées. And there's Elian 4. So overall, you've really got to, once again, give them kudos for accuracy on this map. What you're looking at here now is an actual overview of a section of the campaign map. The hexes are way larger than what we're used to in the world of Advanced Squad Leader, but I would actually argue for a new starter and for other players as well doing campaign games or just any scenarios, this is actually really, really helpful. Because now, let's say within one hex, we'll look at hex U15 in this instance, I have troops who are penned, and then I have troops who are broken under desperation morale. Well, now instead of leaving them in one stack, this one leaves me enough room that I can actually split them. And as a new starter, that is super helpful for memory, or if you're playing against another opponent, then they clearly know, what's going on and what the status is of your troops. So that is actually really, really cool, and this is something, these larger hexes is actually something I would like to see Multiman Publishing, consider doing some of. I know they have some squad leader comps out there that I don't have a lot of information on that do come with the bigger hexes, but I'd love to see more of that. Now, the Dien Bien Phu comp comes with some more traditional geoboards as well, but as you will notice, unlike our MMP releases, they do not come in kind of one unfoldable geoboard map. These two are actually separated. Generally, it's kind of up to the purchaser to kind of decide how you're going to go about organizing this. Once again, I've kind of left everything with the white space around, and I've just simply laminated mine, and when I need to use this, I will go ahead and just kind of tape these together. Now, this map itself, I suppose, is something that would be very hard, I think, for any advanced squad leader company to get is the actual, battlefield of Dien Bien Phu itself, because it had a lot of valleys. It had it was constant. There were certain points where the valley was flooded the entire time, and there were certain points when it was just kind of a harsh jungle terrain, and it had a lot of hills. And I don't really know how much of that you could actually put on a map. I suppose that's why we have the rules for weather conditions and things like that. So all things considered, for this 2000, I think this latest release of the Dien Bien Phu comp, this is a really cool map. And just as a point of reference, I'm going to pull out what they had originally 10 years ago in the 2004 edition. So what we're looking at right here, this is the actual original D2 map from the Dien Bien Phu comp. Now, one advantage of this is it does kind of have the traditional kind of fold and fits the size of the other geo boards from MMP. But that being said, let's take a good, just kind of slow zoom in on this. This, compared to the other D2, is very, very ugly and a living eyesore. And even for more advanced players, like look at that, those little triangles. I have no clue what those means, but I do know this is a horrendous, ugly map, and I'm so happy that they've taken the time to do some quality control with what they're putting out in terms of geoboards now. It seems to me, for every one or two person who's truly interested in the French Indochina War and the American Vietnam War, there's 100 and 200 World War II buffs running around with no knowledge of these conflicts. And frankly, I don't blame them. No one's going to argue the merits of France's own national liberation when its own tankers and troops liberated Paris. On the other hand, when we look at the history of the French Indochina War, they generally called it the Dirty War. With the exception of the disaster of RC4, with de Latre's death and his son's death, and then later the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the war was never popular, nor was it a topic of common conversation. It was often forgotten.
And then on the American side, for veterans that I interviewed and for peace activists that I interviewed, the one thing that they will all say about the conflict is when you kind of get them, you establish a conversation and you kind of get them a little more calmed down, is they'll kind of put you in a corner and just be like, that war was messed up. You don't get that kind of reaction when you're studying World War II, or generally when you meet most World War II veterans. So with that in mind, the one thing we do have in common with our World War II history buff brethren is that accuracy is important. And when we look at an advanced squad leader, we need to take a look at the counters for this game and see how accurate they are to the units depicted and how accurate they are to the uniforms that were used during the conflict. In addition to that, we actually have to look at interplayability, because this comp does not come with enough counters to cover everything you need per scenario. It actually says that when you buy it. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at a couple different counters and see, what we can do to play the game. For a proper point of reference as to how the uniforms are supposed to look and how the counters look, we're going to be looking at how both the Viet Minh and the French paratroopers are described from an artistic standpoint from the French and Indochina War by Martin Woodrow and illustrated by Mike Chappell. This is from the Men at Arms series. World War II buffs, history buffs in general, should know this series pretty well. So the first one we're looking at here, this is Captain Bizard, who led one of the great redeployment of troops from Huguet back into the central base once the Viet Minh had pretty much taken it over. You can see he's actually getting ready for his retreat because he has sandbags that the troops put on during that movement. You can see he's wearing the standard French paratroopers uniform with the now famous lizard camouflage. What we're looking at here is a fully equipped Vietnamese trooper who served in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Look down here, he's kind of got a khaki uniform, demolition charges, grenades, some sort of Chinese or Russian submachine gun. Of particular interest is the winter sweater he has on, and believe it or not, according to Frederick Longville in his great book on the French Indochina War, Embers of War, he points out that Ho Chi Minh actually insisted that during the Dien Bien Phu campaign that his soldiers stay warm and comfortable and go into battle with good winter clothing. So the sweater was something he particularly demanded that the Vietnamese army produce for the troopers. So what we're looking at here is actually an enlarged version of the Dien Bien Phu critical hit counter. As you can look from it, it's pulling almost straight from that description of Captain Bizard. He's got the sandbag on, the French Mat 49, I believe it is, and the grenade. So, and also in addition to that, you can actually see two color tones that actually are put into these smaller counters that we'll look at next. So their homework was really done for these counters, and they obviously put a lot of effort in to get it as accurate as possible given the limitation of size. So right now, and I apologize for the slight shakiness, I'm trying to give you guys the best view possible of the French counters for the paratroopers. And as you can see here, the weapons are accurate. There's a lot of color into, very small counters, and they actually have that kind of, two-tone color for the actual uniforms. Have a 648, which means you're going to roll pretty well with these guys. Overall, it's very historically accurate from what we've seen from Martin Windrow's books and what I know about uniforms of the French Indochina War. So that is a nice little historical accuracy they got within these counters. During the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, Thai units were also deployed. The Thai actually did not have camouflage uniforms. They wore the simple French khaki. They were experts in scouting and experts in ambush and experts in kind of asymmetrical warfare, but they did not do too well being stuck in defensive positions away from their families and homes. So with that in mind, they have a overall kind of lower counter number compared to the French paratroopers. But once again, when we kind of go into that accuracy,
we don't see two-tone colors on their actual uniforms, and we kind of see this blue background to represent that they're kind of irregular troops in a way. So once again, very good job from Critical Hit in regards to the tie counters. What you're looking at here at the very top, kind of the left-hand side, are the 4.58s. Now, the 4.58 counter is kind of standard for the Kriegsdienstgerät infantry, and in 2020, I think it was, MMP re-released that module, and all French counters, whether they're Vinci or not, are now have a color blue on them. So I'm not really bothered that these guys still have the traditional Free French counter color of Britain. I know for a lot of people it tends to bother them. I think the color works for the overall map terrain scenario for Dien Bien Phu. That being said, if they end up going blue for these, I think it'll make a lot of the squad leader community happy, and I'm okay with that change as well. What we're looking at here are the counters for the Viet Minh troops. And the first thing that I noticed is that they've got this kind of orange that is really similar to the brown in Beyond Valor. And that is really, really cool. And if you compare it to the earlier drawings that we looked at of the Viet Minh soldiers, this one here has that same kind of khaki and actually looks like the campaign uniform for the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In addition to that, what I'd like to show is how interchangeable these counters are. So we've got these ones here, and then these are the Soviet Beyond Valor ones, and the color setup is similar enough that I can easily kind of stack these together and work them for some reason if I had to, and everything just kind of works and doesn't look too displeasing to the eye. It's quite good, which is really cool. My only complaint about the Viet Minh counters, and you will not see this because the camera can actually not zoom in this far, is they are actually holding AK-47s, which were not used during this conflict at all. That reason being is Critical Hit also has comps for the Battle of Hue, and they have a comp for the Battle of LZ X-Ray with Al Moore, famously known for We Were Soldiers. So with that in mind, they do have to save money, and I'm absolutely fine with them kind of making that shortcut and just kind of making that generic AK-47 for all the Viet Minh. What you're looking at now are the tanks that come with the Dien Bien Phu Critical Hit ASL comp. One of the biggest complaints from Desperation Morale for Critical Hit products has been that the tanks follow the Genesis 48 system. Genesis 48 was the first major comp that Critical Hit came out with that reenacts the Israeli wars that founded their country. And it did not follow the official advanced squad leader or squad leader kind of setup, counter setup for how tanks are. But if we look at this here, you've got the 244, the large circle, the oval for the 18, front armor, rear armor, all that good stuff. 6.3, it's all the same from what you will now see in squad leader products. So let's take a look just as a point of reference. Here are some French counters, and so we are back to regularity with Critical Hit armored fighting vehicles and multi-man publishing armored fighting vehicles, and I'm really happy they did that. Also, another interesting aspect as far as historical accuracy goes and the Dien Bien Phu comp is there were 10 tanks involved in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. They were kind of given to the French fighting forces by the Americans. It was the M24, which also saw use in Korea. It was kind of a lighter tank, but the Viet Minh had a lot of trouble knocking these guys out. So once again, great historical accuracy, getting the right tank, kind of with accurate attributes that was used in the battle. As the Battle of Dien Bien Phu went on, the strategic objectives for the French High Command changed very quickly. It went from the complete obliteration of Viet Minh forces and a treaty thereafter to simply surviving to get to the conference table at Geneva in hopes that the American and Allied powers would swoop some sort of deal out that allowed the French to retain something of Indochina. For the Viet Minh and for Ho Chi Minh, the battle was always about the liberation of their country.
So when we look at these two strategic objectives, how can they play within the world of Advanced Squad Leader? Within that, we need to take a look at the scenarios and see how do they actually represent that tension in the different strategic plans between the French and the Viet Minh. Also, we need to take a look at what was happening before the majority of the scenarios listed in the Advanced Squad Leader Dien Bien Phu comp. What you're looking at here is the map of Dien Bien Phu from Dien Bien Phu, The Final Gamble by Kim Kanger. And what I'm attempting to do here is just kind of show you how things were looking tactically for both the French and Viet Minh forces, generally for what is most of the scenarios for the Dien Bien Phu ASL comp. Meaning that most of the scenarios for the game happened between March 20th and the end of the battle being May of 1954. So let's take a look. Early within March, the first attack was on Beatrice, followed by Gabriella, followed by Anne-Marie. These three northern strongpoints were essential to be held in order to keep the airstrip alive and have French planes land with supplies and to bring in new troops and to take out the wounded without being harassed by artillery and anti-aircraft guns. So when these 3 points were taken, basically, the battle to some degree was over. When you added this in, plus the flooding of the river, Dien Bien Phu became a tactical nightmare. And just as a point of reference, I am not a flight expert by any means, but these purple lines here, what you're actually looking at is the extremely limited drop area the French had to bring in reinforcements and drop supplies, because after those northern hill points were taken, everything had to be dropped in by air. What we're looking at here is the campaign game that comes with the Dien Bien Phu Advanced Squad Leader comp. It's actually representing combat between the 30th of March, which I mentioned previously, kind of strategically where things are in this game, and April 2nd of 1954. And basically what it is that the French player must hold Champs-Élysées, which is, and Hélène 1, and essentially Hélène 2. And they must hold that against the Viet Minh horde. And something that's very, very kind of strange to me is, although I don't understand the purchase options within a campaign game, that doesn't seem to exist within here. In addition to that, by this point in the battle, for Dien Bien Phu, everything had to be dropped in by air. Airdrops for paratroopers are actually included in the Advanced Squad Leader's rulebook. There's a very kind of clear example for that. So why they didn't put this in as far as getting reinforcements, as a matter of fact, why that doesn't exist for any of the scenarios is very confusing for me. Another thing that I must include is that within the Grand Campaign setup, it says as a note, use your existing counter collecting and purchase of additional copies of the counters provided are needed for CG play. So what they are telling you essentially is we did not provide you enough counters to do the campaign. Something about that just seems not right for me. And once again, you know, on the back of the actual for lack of a better term, box for this Dien Bien Phu Advanced Squad Leader comp, it actually says on it, all you need is the Squad Leader rules book and an interest in World War II, I think African and European history to play this game. Well, the reality is you do need a lot more for that. So they either need to actually do what they did with the first release and include enough counters to play the actual Grand Campaign, or they need to state that very clearly that you need an additional copy or an additional counters to do the campaign. So the Battle of Dien Bien Phu itself, as I mentioned earlier, was a race to the conference table for the French and an attempt for the Viet Minh to liberate their country.
the Grand Campaign scenario does not actually go to the last day of battle, which would have been, I believe, May 6th of 1954. So it also would have been cool to see a Grand Campaign option that actually kind of played maybe the last 10 days of the battle, because that is what was really strategically the most important, and that's where the pressure cooker was. So maybe down the line when Critical Hit releases this comp again, they'll include that last 10 days as a Grand Campaign. Well, doing research for this video review, something that I was surprised about was the amount written about artillery. In particular, the American 105. Bernard Fall writes about it, Martin Woodrow writes about it, Frederick Longville writes about it, Jules Roy writes about it. So the 105 artillery had a pivotal role in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, in so much that the Viet Minh and the French were using the same American 105s. Why is this? Captured surplus weapons from the Korean War were transferred over to the Viet Minh, and one of the most popular and most used ones that was easy for the Chinese to repair and get down to the field was the American 105. And what's very, very odd is that none of the scenarios for this Dien Bien Phu ASL comp include the American 105. And it could be the idea that, well, maybe they'd be short on counters, but between the squad leader starter kits 2 and 3 and the 4th one, in addition to the ordnance given for the French army, you've really probably got enough 105s that they could have been worked in the scenario. And perhaps this was just kind of overlooked, or maybe when they were doing their research for the comp, they decided that the 105 wasn't as important. I do really hope that when they rework these scenarios, as I know they have a history of doing, because the 2004 scenarios are a little differently structured than this latest edition of Dien Bien Phu, that they go back and take a look at the 105 and decide to include some as onboard artillery and some as offboard artillery. And within that kind of scenario option, it'll actually give the new starters the capability to use artillery in the game from what they know, and then if you're a more advanced player, you could use it as offboard. So for a lot of people, this will be the very first time they look at a critical hit scenario card. Very similar to ASL, very similar to multi-man publishing. They've got a use of the red color, which I kind of like. So red for the Viet Minh, and then you have the typical French symbol from kind of the World War II era. In this particular scenario, you only need maps D1 and D2. Hex rows A through S are playable, so you can just kind of play this one out of the box for the most part, as long as you have some understanding of squad leader and how to play it. This one is actually Escape from Huguet 6, and this kind of turns back to Bizard, who we covered earlier, who was getting ready to escape from that particular strong point and kind of redeploy his troops within the central still safe area. We can look down here. This is the one part that is interesting, and I apologize for the camera shake, is unlike multi-man publishing, the actual scenario information and the photo is at the bottom. So that's pretty cool. What you're looking at here is Castor's opening act. It's Dien Bien Phu scenario number 7. In my opinion, it should be Dien Bien Phu scenario number 1. The reason being that this is the actual initial operation that the French used to invade Dien Bien Phu, which would later set up their mooring point, that would turn into a garrison, that would turn into the defensive battle that they lost, that caused them to lose all of Indochina and all the fun that brought along. Now, this scenario here would be the one that, generally speaking, would be for beginners. It's not anything too different from what you'd see on your squad leader starter kit. You've got some infantry, you got a couple leaders, light machine guns. Your objective is the French must exit 8 EVP along the south edge of the game by the end to win. And this one is about 6 turns. My only problem, though, and I apologize, I'm going to have to shake the camera for this, is for this one, you need map 38. So what this means is I cannot play this scenario. I need Code of Bushido. And that is about $200 that I'm not willing to spend, or I can get map 38 from the MMP website, which is eventually probably what I will end up doing. But this still doesn't change the fact that my main concern is if we look at Forgotten War by Korea and we look at Beyond Valor, I have scenarios in there that the game itself provides me everything I need as a new starter to take Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit rules and just play the scenario, or to try them in a more advanced round. The Dien Bien Phu comp and all the scenarios that follow it don't really give you that capability. It's only built for the experienced player, and that includes the 2004 and the 2016 edition. The fact is Squad Leader has changed, and there's a lot more new players, there's a lot more inexperienced players, and we're all over the place. You know that if you listen to the 2.5 Squads, podcast. So with that in mind, I hope when they re-release this game, they include scenarios with the beginner in mind, that you can play just with what they have, and they don't make them too complex. Out of all the writers of Dien Bien Phu and all my years of studying, Jules Roy's become my favorite writer. If anything, in his own way, he managed to keep the story uniquely French, and he was there to actually tell the truth. When looking back at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in his book, he wrote, "There were reasons why Dien Bien Phu was a victory for the less well-equipped of the two armies. At the bottom of everything was a faith, or the lack of faith, the will of a people, or its decline. In the words of a trivial but very common expression, money, women, and power were the three ruling motives in Indochina at that time. Clever ones made a fortune. The soldiers killed or war killed. The corruption of conscience, the misuse of whatever French chivalry still remained, the cowardice of a government leaders in the face of a truth which they refused to see because it would not have called for the virtues they did not practice. Everything predisposed the country for one of the greatest abominations to the century." Earlier in this video I asked, can we take the ambiguous nature of the Cold War and alienor warfare and work it within the squad leader system? Based on reviewing Dien Bien Phu, one could think no. But it's not entirely true. If we look at Advanced Squad Leaders, The Forgotten War, they are doing Cold War scenarios, and things are just working great. And I think that Dien Bien Phu can be wargamed on the squad level using Advanced Squad Leader. It's just that some of the scenarios and the campaign game itself just need to be reworked a little bit. Like I said, we need to put in the fact that, when we look at the campaign game, we need to consider that the French were fighting for time more so than land, while the Viet Minh were actually trying to liberate their country, and that makes things very, very different. In addition to that, we need to keep in mind that when they remake this game, that everything had to be dropped by air. So for some of the scenarios, and definitely for the campaign game, we need to put in that, role and rules for airborne drops. So the other question that, naturally people are going to have is, should I purchase this product or not? For starters, if you are into studying the Vietnam War, and if you're into studying the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, off the bat, you're going to want to buy this just for the maps of Elaine and Champs-Élysées, because they are so impressive and they are so detailed, and there's so much you can do with that to actually study the battle that alone will make you happy. For new starters, for experienced players, I'm actually going to go ahead and encourage you to buy this product if it piques your interest at all. That being said, once you've done that and you've played a couple scenarios and kind of made your own opinions that may agree or disagree with mine, get a hold of Critical Hit and let them know what you're thinking. That's one of the main reasons I did this video, so they could have a clear understanding maybe what's good about this product and what's bad about this product, because the way that particular company works is they go back, reprint, redo, listen to customers, get stuff out there. Again, that's why I said the 2016 edition that I have is just way, way better than the 2004 edition. So that's all I have for you folks. I hope you enjoyed this squad leader review. See ya. Bye.
by the way, in the next couple of months, we're going to Hawaii.